Listen to this podcast, or I'll gut you.
Welcome to the 100th episode of Ghostman and Rivera's Horror Show podcast.
I'm Mike Ghostman Pickle.
And I am James Rivera. We have a very special episode today. We've been doing this for a while. This is our 100th episode, and to celebrate, we're going to be celebrating a century's worth of horror cinema. So we're going to start with going through a little bit of horror history, but ultimately we're going to be today delving from the 1920s onward to celebrate a century's worth of great horror. You want to start it off, Michael? You have some
it feels like a celebration. I've been looking forward to this past few weeks. We took a few weeks off between episode 99 and episode 100 because we really wanted to prepare for this, because 100 years of horror. Come on, look at all the horror that's been bestowed upon us for the last 100 years, and we had to celebrate it in the proper way. Mm-hmm. So we skipped a few weeks, the most we've skipped so far, but we're back, and we're going to keep going weekly from now on. And today we're going to start with, first of all, we're going to go through 100 years of horror. And before the 20s, trick films were among the first horror films to become popular, which is films that use camera tricks and anything they could to make it seem otherworldly or surreal. Mm-hmm. Those were mostly horror films before the 20s. So then when the 20s came, there was the rise of German Expressionism, especially after The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It was hugely popular. And it was also the birth of the Universal Monsters, the silent era. And the word horror was not even used in the 20s. The word horror wasn't used until the 30s. So we didn't even know that we were making horror films at that time. So we're going to go through each decade, and James and I are each going to talk about one film in particular that really stands out to us in that decade. And we have not told each other our picks, so it's going to be a surprise for us as we go through them. So we'll start off with James. James, what is your pick for the 1920s horror?
Well, there's actually a really couple of good options, and the typical answer you would normally hear is either Nosferatu or The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And I love both of those movies. They're both masterpieces. Cabinet of Dr. Caligari in particular is a great example of like that German expressionism, the way that the shadows are so severely slanted. It has such a ghost-like atmosphere. I think a lot of the shadows were even painted on the wall in that film.
Yeah.
I understand. And then, of course, 1922, just 2 years after that, you got Nosferatu, which is from F.W. Murnau, one of the essential films of horror of all time. And I think Max Schreck's portrayal of Nosferatu is kind of timeless. There's nothing dated about the performance. It's great. Having said that, I'm going to have to go with A Page of Madness from 1926, the Japanese film directed by Tenosuke Kunagasa. The director was actually a Japanese actor and film director. He was born in Kanaya and died in Kyoto. He won the 1954 Palme d'Or at the Cannes Film Festival for his film The Gate of Hell. So the reason I picked this one is because Page of Madness from 1926 is one of the most unique films I have ever seen in my life. It is the story about a janitor who takes a job at an asylum to free his imprisoned wife, but is drawn into a descent of madness where reality and shocking fantasy are inseparable. So basically in this movie, and this is, just to clarify, this is a Japanese silent film without title cards. So the entire thing is told visually. And I'd like to warn the audience that occasionally some of the storytelling points are a little bit muddled because it's hard to tell a little bit what exactly is going on. But it hardly matters because the movie is mostly about this man's descent into madness and his inability to tell the difference between reality and what's in his head. And this movie feels like watching this movie. I actually watched it last year for the first time. It felt like I uncovered something that exists almost beyond cinema, beyond films, and beyond horror, because the techniques that are used in this film, the level of surrealism and the weirdness in this film are completely off the charts. It makes movies that came out far later, like decades later, look, I don't know, timid or not as experimental as we would like to think. Like, it kind of leapfrogs over a bunch of like it took how do I say this more clearly? It feels like it's a movie that's kind of leapfrogged over the entire history of cinema, because it took most filmmakers decades to get to the point where they can make the types of movies that A Page of Madness is. And I feel like this movie is kind of a forgotten gem that's been rediscovered in recent years, but it is so creepy. I guarantee you, if you put this on for any modern audience and make them sit for a long time watching it, even if they're not interested in it first, they will get creeped out. They will get uncomfortable. You're going to feel goosebumps rising. The movie has so many visual tricks that seem so far ahead for a movie in 1926. The way that the camera moves, the way that images are superimposed on each other, like really fast editing techniques where some of the best editing from the silent era that I've seen, aside from Battleship Potemkin. But it has like really innovative editing style that keeps the movie in a frenzy. And some of the imagery is so jarring and so shocking that it kind of like works its way into your head while you're watching it. And it is truly a film, A Page of Madness. You really feel like you are reading A Page of Madness and falling into it. It's a wonderful movie. Like I said, the images are really jarring. It's shocking. It's dazzling. And even when it doesn't make total sense, you still have it still gives you a certain feeling, and you kind of know where it's going. Great film, A Page of Madness. I really think that this is a masterpiece. Like, this is a great film. It's only 70 minutes long. And if you enjoy like David Lynch films, if you enjoy any type of surreal horror, this is going to blow you away. It kind of amazes me that in 1926 in Japan, they were doing things that it would take decades for other filmmakers to figure out how to do, like so far ahead of its time that it doesn't even seem like it's from 1926. It could give a lot of like the weirder, stranger more modern, strange titles of horror a run for their money.
And I actually have not seen Page of Madness. I really want to see it. There's so many that I slept on in the 20s, 30s, and 40s. I didn't even realize how much until we really started diving into it. That's why I love this podcast. Just diving into these decades of horror and seeing that the history we already knew to be rich in the horror genre was even richer than we thought.
So, do you like the movie Repulsion, Michael?
Yes.
Okay. This is kind of like Repulsion, except it's a male going insane, and it is far more sinister and surreal than Repulsion. So it kind of takes that descent into madness and pumps it up to levels that are way beyond what Roman Polanski was doing 30, 40 years later. That give you an idea of the type of horror film. Like, I really think you need to see it. It'll give you chills at times. The imagery is so beautiful, and it's magical to sit there and think that you're watching from something that was from almost a century ago, that's as effective as it is, that's so modern, that feels so far ahead of its time, that feels like, I mean, I don't know, I wouldn't say it looks like it could have been made now. A lot of people like to say, I'm not going to say that, but it feels like other surrealist films should have gotten to this level by now.
And it's a fascinating era in general, just for all cinema. But then to see it from the horror perspective, it's really fascinating.
I also think it's because what makes these early movies so effective, so shockingly effective, is the fact that they were told only through visuals. So they had to really get down and get creative and concentrate on delivering something that was going to be effective to the audience without dialogue, without words, it forced a certain type of creativity. And for horror, that's great. That's great, especially for a genre like horror.
Yeah. And there's so many gems in the 20s, like you said, Nosferatu, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and then Universal came out with Hunchback of Notre Dame. That was their first monster movie, and The Phantom of the Opera. Haxan, which I haven't seen, is supposed to be a more raw 1920s horror film.
Phantom of the Opera is also one of the great ones from that decade.
Yeah.
But those already have, I feel like those are, I don't know. I feel like we need to highlight some of the titles that kind of slid through the cracks, though.
Yeah, that's why I chose this other one. And one that really broke my heart when I was searching the 20s, I really wanted to see London After Midnight, and then I found out it's been completely lost. What a tragedy, dude.
That is, I mean, that's from an era when a lot of studios only saw movies as products and shelved the film prints away, and sometimes they got damaged or destroyed, and they didn't take any care to preserve them or do anything to them. And I think it is sad that these movies that existed, the stuff that could have been preserved for generations to observe and look back on, is gone. Because watching films from the 1920s is like a time capsule. What makes it also so magical to me is it feels like you are seeing something that happened in the 1920s in front of your eyes. Like, yes, I know that the movies are fictional, but those actors are actually doing what they're doing. They've captured a moment in time and frozen it and preserved it and allowed us to live in it. These are great documents to our documents of their time, and they're kind of connections to our past.
Exactly. That's why I love all these production houses and stuff, or editing houses that get these old movies and restore them and go through the painstaking labor of doing it.
Mm-hmm.
and keeping this history preserved. But so there was a lot to choose from in the 20s, and in case you haven't guessed by my background picture, I chose The Phantom Carriage from 1921. This is one of those movies where I cannot believe I've gone through my whole life, that this has existed my entire life, and I'm just now discovering it.
Mm-hmm.
It was not only one of the best horror films I've ever seen, it's one of the best films I've ever seen, period. It's directed, co-written by, and starring Victor Sjöström, who's known as the father of Swedish film. And it's based on a novel by Selma Lagerlöf about a Swedish folktale that every New Year's Eve, the last person of the year to die, who is a great sinner, will take over as the driver of the phantom carriage and collect the souls of the dead. Now, and you can tell by watching this movie how much this director, Victor Sjöström, labored over this. He immersed himself in the Swedish slums to play the mean, drunk David Holm. It's one of the meanest and most despicable characters I've ever seen on film. And the fact that the director is still able to redeem him somehow is just fascinating to watch. So this character, David Holm, is forced by the current phantom carriage driver to reflect on his wasted life. And what I noticed right away, I watched this right after I did the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And on the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, it's very clear to me that it was pieces of music just thrown onto the movie and to the images without much care to match the music with the images. This was totally different. The amazing music begins right at the title sequences, and then you get these pieces of music that are perfectly placed to end and begin at precisely the perfect moment. It sounds like it was made for it, which scores were not made for movies until the 30s. So the fact that this felt so cohesive, it was heartbreaking, scary, uplifting, but always seemed cohesive. And then the score even becomes insane, chaotic, and unnerving when it needs to. So it drives the emotion home, it drives the creepiness home, and it just encapsulates everything that's special about this movie, and everything works in perfect unison to get under your skin and also tug at your heartstrings by the end of it. Everything special about this, from the drunks getting philosophical in the graveyard, and that's when you can really see that the director immersed himself in the world of the slums.
Mm-hmm.
And then the special effects in this, just the carriage itself and the design of Death was so impressive. And then they show Death gathering souls, and it's just, wow. If I saw it today, I would be impressed by it. You see Death go around, he picks up a soul from the bottom of the ocean. Mm-hmm. You see the transparent figure rise up out of the body as he picks him up and takes him to the carriage. And this effect was done with multiple exposures in the camera, because optical printing wasn't even available yet. So it must have been a huge task to do these awesome effects. And then the really deep emotion comes in the film when this one girl, she works at one of the like it's kind of a halfway house. He's the main character is drunk off his ass and he passes out in this halfway house. And this girl takes a shine to him, so she fixes his coat for him and caters to him and tries to get him to be a good person. And he does stuff like rips the coat up right in front of her. And he's just so mean and cruel to her. And then she pretty much makes it her life's mission to change him and to make sure that his soul is saved before he dies, because she doesn't want him to go to hell. So then we slowly start to see how sad this man's life is and why he's such a prick. And then the Phantom Carriage driver takes him through his life, like him tormenting his poor wife to the point of suicide. And she has these great lines like, "Haven't you had enough revenge, David?" It just gets you right in the soul. And then, like I said, the most impressive thing to me is a seemingly unredeemable character is somehow redeemed in the final scene. You see him being relentlessly mean and evil bastard through the whole thing. And then for it to redeem him in the final scene when he begs the Lord to spare his wife and kids, it was like the credits ended, it went black, and it was like a delayed reaction. I just busted out crying.
Really?
It moved me so deeply. Like while I was watching it, I was so in awe of what I was watching that it didn't stir the emotions like that until it ended and I reflected back on it. And I'm not sure if you can tell when you watch it, but it should have been heavily censored. But I found it funny that the Board of Censors did not censor the movie because they feared the wrath of the author of the novel, Selma Lagerlof, because they didn't want her wrath for cutting her story down. So they left everything intact, and it's pretty graphic, especially for the time. And I love the story about how Selma Lagerlof was looking for someone to direct the story, and the director went to her home and acted out the entire movie in front of her and collapsed on the couch, almost passing out. And she looked at him for a long time and then offered him a drink. So that was her approval that, yes, you impressed me. I want you to do my movie. And he did an excellent job with it. And it influenced the work of Ingmar Bergman, who watched it every summer. And Charlie Chaplin once said it was the best film ever made. And also the Here's Johnny scene in The Shining was a tribute to the scene where David Holm breaks down the door to get his wife. But this scene in this movie was inspired by the scene in Broken Blossoms in 1918.
Oh, I've seen Broken Blossoms before. That's one of the old movies I've seen that's actually really good. I have a question for you, because you seem to have a strong reaction. We're trying to highlight movies from certain decades, not necessarily picking what we think is the best. However, I get the feeling, do you think this is a better film than like Nosferatu or Dr. Caligari, which are the default answers almost every time?
It's the best I've seen of the 20s so far, and I've seen some excellent films from the 20s.
Yeah, I'm choosing to highlight things, but same thing is true. I don't just think that A Page of Madness deserves to be highlighted more because it's unknown. I actually do think it is a better film than Nosferatu and the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. And I would go out on a limb and say it's one of the best films I've ever seen in my life, and that it's a masterpiece. And you seem to have a similar reaction to the film that you've picked.
Yeah, because before I watched this, I was tossing up like, what should I pick? Nosferatu, Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Phantom of the Opera. These are all great movies. And then I watched Phantom Carriage, and it moved me so deeply. And it not only moved me deeply, it impressed me as a filmmaker and as a fan of film. It was the Criterion version. I saw it on the Turner Classic Movies, so it wasn't full Blu-ray quality, but it was pretty high quality. Mm-hmm. And it looked like it was made 50 years later than it was. Mm-hmm. It was like you could literally look at the set design, and it felt like you could reach out and pick up a bottle off the counter.
Interesting. because A Page of Madness is actually not restored to that extent, and a lot of the film print, you know how a lot of old film prints look after they've been out. So if you watch it, it does look a little bit old. I also think that it works in its favor because it makes the images look eerier when they look more antiquated. Where I'm like, I mean, a restoration would be fine, but it's one of those rare cases to me where I don't think that it necessarily needs that upgrade because it has such an eerie, unearthly quality to it as it is.
I need to see that one along with a few others from the 20s.
So now we're going into the 1930s.
Yeah, that brings us to the 30s, where this was the golden age of the Universal monsters. This is when they become really popular. But also toward the end of the 30s was already the decline of the golden age of Universal monsters. This is the decade we saw movies like Dracula, Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, The Invisible Man, The Mummy. So many great movies. So what was your choice for the 1930s, Mr. James?
Okay, so this one was actually, I think, the hardest one for me to pick because there's several things from the 1930s that I think deserve to be highlighted. I'm going to mention a few of them because they deserve to be mentioned. One is The Black Cat, which is based on the short story by Edgar Allan Poe. Really, it's not. They say it's inspired by it, but it has very little to do with the actual story. It's basically a horror film that is a showdown between Bela Lugosi and Boris Karloff. It is so fucking entertaining. The other one that I almost considered was White Zombie, also with Bela Lugosi. I thought that was such a wonderful movie that took me back in time, and Bela Lugosi's screen presence was really magnetizing. What else was there? The Actual Dracula is a good movie. Bride of Frankenstein is wonderful. Frankenstein is wonderful. A lot of the Val Lewton films. But out of all those, I had to go with Vampire, spelled Vampyr, from 1932, directed by Karl Theodor Dreyer. It is a German film. Now, Karl Theodor Dreyer also directed the 1928 film, The Passion of Joan of Arc. One of the greatest films ever made. If you have not seen The Passion of Joan of Arc, you have to see it. It is a masterpiece. It's transcendent. This is his other masterpiece, in my opinion, is Vampire. And it's about a traveler whose name is Alan Gray. He studies vampires and satanic worship. He gets so involved in satanic worship and vampirism and all these old superstitions and myths that the way the movie plays out, he can't tell the difference because he falls so deeply into it. And the movie, in the movie, he takes residence at a small inn where he feels sinister forces plunging upon him. In the middle of the night, he is visited by an old man who gives him an ominous warning saying, "Don't let her die." And through that, he's led on a journey, an odyssey through the night where he encounters real-life vampires. It is one of the most haunting movies I've ever seen. Its atmosphere is something that's truly off the charts. It's a little similar to A Page of Madness in one way, and they're both very surreal, deeply strange horror films. But whereas A Page of Madness is kind of a movie that becomes chaotic and really fast-paced and kind of dazzling, this one is very slow and stately and completely eerie. And I actually think as a vampire film, it outdoes some of a lot of the atmosphere from Nosferatu. I think that it has a stronger sense of atmosphere. And while we don't have as iconic of vampires in this movie, they're regular people, there's something a little bit effective about seeing regular people looking deranged as opposed to someone who looks like a rodent in human form coming after you.
Yeah.
And some of the effects in this movie are like mind-blowing to me. You talked about how the Phantom Carriage, they did things that blow your mind. In this movie, people will be sitting somewhere and you will see their spirit leave their body, and you could see the soul, somebody will be sitting in one position and then you will see their soul walk away from the body as it stays still, and you could tell it's the soul because it looks half solid and half kind of transparent. These wonderful effects of ghost walking around that actually look very ghostly, and it kind of blew me away. I was like, wow, in the 1930s they were able to achieve ghosts that look like that. They were able to achieve the effect of making it look like somebody actually had an out-of-body experience and somebody left their own body. Another interesting thing it does is with the shadows that are really creepy. Sometimes a shadow will be behind somebody, somebody will be standing there and they're not casting any shadow when they should be, and then you see their shadow run up to catch up and then strike the same pose that they're doing and go to the right spot. All these like wonderful camera tricks that kind of like put you in this weird state of mind where you're like, what's real, what's not? And the vampires, like the vampire attacks are, for a 1930s film, they're subtle, you barely see them, but they're very, I don't know how to put it, they're very effective. And the whole movie has an eerie, ghostly quality, especially towards the beginning when Alan Gray is staying at the inn and he's visited by the old man. Almost kind of like a Christmas Carol quality, somebody visiting you in the middle of the night and saying something weird or ominous that sends him off on a journey where he tries to save a vulnerable soul who's under attack from vampires and vampirism. There's a cipher of death that walks through this movie that's really creepy. So much going on within this film. You got to see it. It's an amazing film. And of course, another one of them uses a lot of smoke in the movie, a lot of early use of smoke to get a certain type of atmosphere going in it. Great movie, 1932, Carl Theodor Dreyer's Vampire. And like I said, that was a hard pick because there are so many great movies from the 1930s. I even almost considered King Kong, but I don't know if I consider that enough of a horror movie to make it as my pick for the 1930s. But yeah, Vampire, Carl Theodor Dreyer.
Well, I got to see that one. That's another one I haven't seen, Vampire. So since you already mentioned King Kong, I'll go ahead and say that my choice for the 1930s, I know, typical choice, one of the biggest films of the biggest monster movies of the 30s, King Kong. But I just couldn't deny rewatching it again, because I watched it a couple times when I was little, and a couple times over the years as I grew. And then watching it now as a filmmaker, I felt the same glee and magic that I felt when I was a kid. And then I felt the skill and the passion that went into making it as a filmmaker. So I just had to talk about this one. It was directed by Marion C. Cooper and Ernest S. Schudsack, and it's based on a story by Edgar Wallace. It stars Fay Wray, Robert Armstrong, and Bruce Cabot. It's about a filmmaker, Carl Denham, played by Armstrong, finds his perfect leading lady and takes a film crew to Skull Island for the perfect location for his film, but neglects to tell them that he is attempting to capture a giant ape on film. He then brings Kong back to the States for exhibition. And every part of this is impressive, from the acting to the stop motion animation to the monster violence, everything. This was actually the biggest opening weekend of any movie so far when it came out, and it's one of the first films that, as I mentioned before, with the score made for it. Besides it being an awesome monster movie, it had genuine conflict and genuine dramatic moments in the acting and the writing, especially for a film that leans heavily on the spectacle and the giant monsters. And I love how as they get close to the island, you hear these tribal drums, and it makes for a creepy, ominous, like there's
it's like you're being lulled, like you feel like you're being lulled into the island by the music as it keeps approaching. It's kind of something like hypnotic or rhythmic going on in there.
Yeah, and another thing I loved about it, it perfectly illustrates guerrilla filmmaking, no pun intended. Like the run and gun shooting, like you're yeah. But you go to places you're not supposed to be, and you kind of have to get in and out before you get caught. Kind of like that. This guy acted just like us when we were filming horror show.
I hope we're as reckless as that guy. I'll say that much.
I know, right? With people's lives, jeez. But impressive set design throughout. All the natives were awesome. The costumes, as I said, top-notch stop motion animation, especially when the people were in the shot. I found out that the reason why this looks so real and so good to this day is this is the first movie that used animation models with metal skeletons. which is
Interesting.
why they were able to get better movement and everything. And then all the shots of the dinosaurs, especially a really creepy shot of the dinosaur rising up out of the water, and then it's really graphic because you see the dinosaurs like snatching people out of the water and eating them, and some guy's hiding up in a tree and he snatches them out of the tree and eats them, and then the violence just piles on itself after
That
that.
scene isn't dated, by the way, because what makes it, I think, effective is when the scene is playing out. You see, like when they're in the water, you see mostly a mist of smoke and like this slimy thing rising out of the water. And because you don't see it very well, but you could tell it's big and slimy, and you could tell that it looks pretty realistic, like there's actually something rising out of the water, or when it actually lifts them out and starts attacking them. That particular sequence you're talking about has aged very well.
Yeah, and just the design of the dinosaurs and Kong itself was just so impressive and looked really real. And then when all those men were crawling up that big giant tree, and Kong just takes the whole tree and shakes it, and it shows them falling down into the ravine, and their bodies tumbling over each other and hitting rocks, and it's really graphic. And especially the part where he rips the dinosaur's jaw open, and you see the blood oozing out, and you hear the jaw cracking. He fights a snake, he fights a pterodactyl, he eats people, he smashes them with his fist and with his feet, and they even has these little comedic moments. Like, you remember the part where he holds up Fay Ray and he's like tickling her, and then he snips his finger. Total like pervy guy move.
Well, what I think is interesting about the original King Kong, and it's something that I think Peter Jackson's adaptation, which I like, doesn't really get right, is it's Kong is supposed to be scary. He's mean. You do feel sympathy for him when he's being shot off of the Empire State Building, but it's not the type of sympathy that Peter Jackson asks of his audience, where they share cute moments they share cute moments, and there's these beautiful moments on ice where they're sliding together and enjoying these wonderful things, and all this humanization, and how much she actually cares about the monster and how she doesn't want him to get hurt. By adding that, it takes out some of the effectiveness of the original. The original, what I like about it is, yeah, Kong liked her, but it's a mean, vicious monster movie. She's never endeared to the monster. She doesn't like him, and she doesn't have sympathy from him, and she's actually very frightened of him. It's not something sweet. Yeah. It just feels like such a it's the same story as Peter Jackson's, but so much leaner and meaner and ruthless. There's like a meanness in that version of King Kong that I feel is lacking in a lot of the other ones a lot of the Kong movies that have come in recent years. They've never got him. His characterization has never been as scary as it was in the original 1930s King Kong.
Yeah, because he's a vicious wild animal who takes a shine to this human woman, but he's still very dangerous to her and everyone around him.
Yeah, you don't get the sense that there's like a cutesiness going on and they have a rapport with each other, and like, no, none of that nonsense. He's a horrifying giant monster, and I think that makes it more effective.
Even like the part that was especially shocking to me when he was in New York and he reached in that building and he was looking for Fay Ray, and he grabs the wrong woman, and he looks at his hand and he realizes he grabs the wrong woman, and he throws her to her death. So this is a dangerous, vicious animal.
Yeah, and this really quick, I wanted to say something. This is why I'm blown away by a lot of older films. Much like Vampire and A Page of Madness, there are effects in this movie that you look at and you can't comprehend how they got a person and what is obviously like a claymation in the same frame to make it look like they're actually in the same frame, even when they're not. But it looks kind of believable. There's a couple shots here and there where you could tell that they're against a screen, but for the most part, it looks like they are occupying the same space. Kind of blows me the same way that the way people leave their own bodies in Vampire, the way that in A Page of Madness, the film itself seems to like tear itself apart and go insane. Like, it really amazes me the level of creativity that a lot of the filmmakers went for during this time.
And plus the pacing and the spectacle of this film. Once the violence and the action and the monster violence starts, it's relentless all the way up to the end. Like
Yeah.
all the stuff on the island with him fighting dinosaurs and shit, that all feels like a full movie. I was fully satisfied. I remember watching it the first time. I was fully satisfied with them being on that island and everything they went through there. And then it immediately goes, no him hawing around, it immediately goes to New York and he's on exhibition.
Yep.
And then the tension is immediately there. He's already agitated by press taking photos of him. And he breaks out and destroys a train. He's knocking planes out of the sky, which still looks pretty real to this day.
It's a model of kind of like an economic effectiveness, because I felt like any movie with the scale of that made today, there would be a mandate to make it a 2.5 hour, 3 hour long bloated epic. People don't seem to have it in them to make a movie on this scale and have it lean and mean and just get from point A to point B to point C just like that, really fast. There's like an effectiveness in this that today's modern spectacles don't have, because they kind of get lost in bloat and extraneous exposition. This movie is like, it just wastes no time telling its story.
Yeah. I was impressed all over again. Like I said, I watched it several times throughout my life, and I'm still more impressed with the original King Kong than I am any of the copies.
I agree.
Especially that trash Skull Island. That was just
Agreed. It is the best one. Amazing film. Amazing movie.
So that brings us to the 40s, a very strange decade for horror. It seems like the Universal monster golden age was already died out. It seemed like studios didn't know what to do with horror anymore, so they started churning out sequels. And Wolfman was made in the 40s, right at the beginning of the 40s, but that was really the length of what Universal did that decade. And then you had Bela Lugosi in movies like Spooks Run Wild, which was silly and entertaining, but it was just beneath Bela Lugosi and just a goofy film. But you still got films like Cat People, Phantom of the Opera, another Phantom of the Opera, The Uninvited, The Body Snatcher, Dead of Night, Picture of Dorian Gray. So you still had some standouts in horror, but it wasn't like the decade before or after. So what was your choice for the 40s, James?
My choice was Cat People from 1942, directed by Jack Rees-Tournier and produced for RKO by Val Lewton. Val Lewton was one of the most notorious producers of horror films in the 30s and 40s. He made very low-budget movies they were kind of like, how do I put it? I wouldn't say the antidote to Universal monster movies, but a different option for a different style of horror if you were looking for something, I guess, more psychological, more sophisticated. I feel like the Universal monster movies are horror movies for the public, for a generalized audience, whereas the Val Lewton films are catered specifically to more, I would guess I'd say more hardened horror movie fans. They're more psychological. They're very interesting. He wrote most or all of them and produced them. He never directed them, but he had a knack for producing a lot of these really effective films. So my pick, the Cat People, tells the story of Irene Dubrona, a newly married Serbian fashion illustrator who's obsessed with the idea that she's descended from an ancient tribe of cat people who metamorphose into panthers when they are aroused. When her husband begins to show interest in one of her coworkers, Irene begins to stalk her and starts acting very strange. This movie stars Simone Simon as Irina. It also has Ken Smith, Tom Conway, and Jane Randolph. Now, this one really impressed me because I didn't think that they were making these types of psychological horror films in the 1940s. You saw it as well, didn't you, Michael?
Yes, I loved it.
You loved it, yeah. One of the things that I liked about it is I felt like a lot of the movie, the story behind it is meant to be a metaphor for female sexuality and how society has a fear of female sexuality. Because in this movie, the main character, she doesn't really show any affection to her husband. She doesn't. They don't really sleep together. They don't even really kiss or do anything like that. And you get the feeling that she wants to, but she's haunted by this idea that if she shows anything like that for him, she's going to turn into a panther person and start tearing her apart. And originally the whole idea of it was designed to be a metaphor for how society fears female sexuality. So the movie is teasing this throughout the whole thing, and that's pretty, I think, ballsy to do in the early 1940s, to make a movie that is a blatant metaphor for sexuality, and then to do it as a horror film. I think that's something that's kind of ahead of the curve. One of the great things that I like about it is the way that it's shot. It is so eerie, and I think the best sequence in this movie is one that takes place in a pool, where Irene is attacking the woman that she's jealous of. Not really attacking her, just frightening her, where she corners this woman into jumping into a pool, and literally nothing happens in the scene. All you hear is some strange sounds. The camera angle keeps switching from the pool to the shadows on the wall to the pool to her looking horrified, and it's hypnotic, and literally nothing happens in that scene, but it is so fucking creepy. And I think that is the work of masterful filmmaking, when you can get a scene where literally nothing is going on and still make the audience feel completely unnerved and uncomfortable. No violence erupts out of that scene, nothing like that at all. Nothing is shown, yet when it's over, you felt like you went through something a little traumatic with the character that the character also just experienced. I love the use of shadows on the wall when she turns into like kind of a panther. You see kind of like the shadows on the wall when she's attacking people. I think the conflict was interesting. I liked all the characters. I thought the writing was really on point. I really loved the psychologist character. Obviously, some of the psychology is a little bit wonky here and there. It's the 1940s. But I thought this was a very fascinating horror film that creeped me out in ways that horror movies from that era typically don't creep me out. I feel like the things that this movie does are things that horror movies do, but they usually did it in a more modern era. And I feel like those types of horror movies you see a little bit more in the decades to come. So I felt like this one was a little bit ahead of the curve and ahead of its time. Originally, the ending of the movie did not have her reveal. You did not see that she was an actual panther. He wanted to keep it ambiguous throughout the whole thing, so you're never really sure, but the producers insisted that they show that it's a panther at the end. So at the end, you see her as a dead panther. Regardless, I thought it was a wonderful movie. Cat people.
I found it to be very measured and sophisticated, but it was very effective when it wanted to be, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It seemed very sophisticated in the storytelling and the building of the atmosphere and everything like that.
Yeah. Doesn't it feel like, I don't know how to put it, but like, I wouldn't say elevated horror, but it seemed what you would call elevated horror these days. It seems to be more in league with that than it does to be with Universal monster movies.
Yeah, a lot of subtleties, very psychological.
And really quick, I wanted to mention, the other movie, another Val Lewton movie is another one that I almost picked, was I Walked with a Zombie, which one of the early zombie films. So good, and it was a real struggle, and I think Cat People just barely edged it out, but that was not an easy decision to go by. Also check out I Walked with a Zombie, so you could see a zombie film before they were actually zombie films, when the subgenre of zombies actually meant you were going to watch a movie about voodoo and black magic. Really fascinating. But yeah, check that one out. That's my secondary recommendation, is I Walked with a Zombie.
That's funny that you would mention that, because my choice is I Walked with a Zombie.
Oh, really?
And
awesome. Like,
I
also
felt
think that.
I felt it was really difficult to choose between Cat People and I Walked with a Zombie, but I liked I Walked with a Zombie just a little bit more.
I'm glad we went that way, because we would have ended up picking the same thing if we just had our opinions slightly smidged in a different direction. Like, I really considered I Walked with a Zombie. I thought about it for a minute. I played in my head, and I ultimately went with Cat People.
Yeah, this one just overall it just creeped me out more, and there was more details in it that grabbed me as being more overtly horror. And this one, and you can tell it's directed by the same director of Cat People, Jacques Tourneur. he also directed another one of my favorites from the 50s, Curse of the Demon. And it stars Francis D. and Tom Conway, who was also in Cat People. Based on the novel Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. It's about Betsy, played by Francis D., a young Canadian nurse, arrives in the West Indies to care for Jessica, the wife of a wealthy plantation owner, Paul Holland, played by Conway. Jessica has become a zombie after suffering a tropical fever, and after Betsy falls for Paul, she sets out to use voodoo to cure Jessica because she thinks that's what Paul wants. Now, this one, I loved it for a lot of the reasons why I loved Cat People. A very strong female lead. So I was impressed with every time she was on screen. The dynamic between Betsy and the two brothers was really fun to watch. Their banter back and forth and the tension between them. And much like King Kong, the tribal drums really help add to the atmosphere and the element of danger in this, and like danger's looming just on the horizon.
I think it's even more effectively used here than King Kong.
Yeah. Yeah, and the whole sequence of going through the cornfield to see the voodoo priest when they're taking the zombie through the cornfield, such a great sequence. And then you see that tribesman with the white eyes that kind of hangs out in the fields just looming, and you never know if or when he will be a threat. Because a lot of times he seems like a harmless, dead to the world type of zombie, but you never know when he's going to attack. And then the ritual that they do on the zombie woman, it's amazing and highly effective. It's very detailed and real, from the actual ritual itself to the set designs to the costume. I love the whole sequence where the natives lure the zombie woman to them with a doll ritual. Like
I was actually about to say that's my favorite sequence in the movie, when they're doing the dance and he's pulling the doll forward and she keeps walking and the doll gets stuck. A lot of that was pretty hypnotic.
And then they have these great lines like, "Pity them that are dead, give peace and happiness to the living." It's just very kind of poetic in a dark way. I love the whole voodoo element. I love when voodoo is done right, like in Serpent and the Rainbow, Wes Craven's movie. I love when it's done right, because it can be really creepy, and it's got this element of tradition to it that makes it feel authentic, almost like it could actually work.
Can I give a shout out to Tom Conway, who I feel, I've watched several of these movies and he's in a lot of them. I almost feel like he's a Christopher Lee or a Vincent Price of a more low budget sort in a different era, but has that side. I don't know. He has like this classical presence to him. The way that he speaks, it feels like he's meant to be in horror movies, but not just any type of horror movies, specifically sophisticated horror films. Like it's like he's tailor-made to be in those, and I've enjoyed his presence in all of these movies, and I kind of feel like I have that same type of feeling off that I would get off of a Christopher Lee or someone like that.
Yeah, and I'd also like to point out with this movie, another thing that I completely nerded out about. I was so excited when I found out about this, and when I actually heard the song in the movie. There's a song, "Shame and Scandal in the Family." It's one of my favorite songs of all time. It's a calypso song I thought it was a calypso song from the 50s from this artist, Lord Creator, that I like a lot. But little did I know, "Shame and Scandal in the Family" was written by Sir Lancelot for this movie. So Sir Lancelot himself actually got with the director to write "Shame and Scandal in the Family" that turned into a classic that I love. But it was, like I said, it was also recorded by calypso artist Lord Creator in the 50s, and I always thought it was his. So I thought it was a really exciting thing for me to hear one of my favorite songs, and find out that the origin was this horror movie. So that was really cool.
What I would like to recommend to the audience is I Walked with the Zombie. You should watch it with Cat People. They're both free on Amazon Prime, and each one barely runs over an hour. They're just like 5 or 6 minutes longer than an hour. It would make a perfect double feature, because what I really love about delving into the past is the zombie genre, and how it is so different than our modern conception of what zombies are based on the George A. Romero model. And I find that, I don't know, it's almost like, I feel like you can't even call this like a zombie movie because the subgenre is completely different than something like Night of the Living Dead or Dawn of the Dead or Return of the Living Dead. It's a voodoo film. The early zombie movies are so different that they almost feel like they should be classed in a different genre. And hey, I would like to see the return of voodoo zombies. I feel like people might be afraid to do it, or companies will be afraid to invest in it because if they put zombie in the title, they're going to think people are going to expect, ravenous, flesh-hungry zombies. But we don't see that kind of horror anymore.
I would love to see, or I would love to do a movie like Angel Heart or Serpent and the Rainbow. That'd be so awesome.
Yeah. Yeah, we both picked Val Lewton.
Great movies.
Yes.
So that brings us to a very fun and interesting decade for horror, the 50s.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mentioned in the 40s how the studios didn't know what to do with horror, so they started churning out a bunch of sequels. Well, in the 50s, they found out what to do with horror because of the advanced technology with things like 3D. So this new technology completely changed the face of horror, especially with 3D. And then we've seen the rise of doomsday films, and sci-fi horror became mega popular. So we had alien invasions, mutations, and giant monsters. And then Universal found a new market with Abbott and Costello films. So they recycle all their old Universal monsters and put them up against Abbott and Costello and comedy films and do that. And much like the 40s, they had one standout film, amazing standout film, by the way, Creature from the Black Lagoon, which is one of my favorites.
That's
and
one of the Universal monster movies.
Yeah, I almost picked that for the 50s, but it was just too obvious. So in the 50s, we had ones like Creature from the Black Lagoon, Curse of the Demon, which I mentioned is one of my favorites. I almost picked that one, but I couldn't find it to rewatch, so I didn't pick it. So Invasion of the Body Snatchers, The Fly, The Bad Seed, Godzilla, Them. A lot of great movies in the 50s. So which horror film did you pick from the 50s, Mr. James?
Well, I'm going to break from tradition. I'm normally the type that would pick the artsy, fartsy, highbrow thing of each decade. And if you look at my choices like Cat People and Vampire and A Page of Madness, it would indicate something. And with the 1950s, there's no shortage of options like that. We have Night of the Hunter, which is an absolute masterpiece. Gotta see it. We have the French film from Henry Georges Clouzot, Diabolique, which is the equivalent to a French Hitchcock film. You got all the wonderful Universal monster movies. But I'm going to have to go with A Bucket of Blood, Roger Corman's dirty little film from 1959, satirizing the beatnik scene. Bucket of Blood is a 1959 American comedy horror film. It's directed by the legendary Roger Corman, one of the, how would you call him? He's like the godfather of exploitation cinema, a king of pop cinema. He basically brought up Martin Scorsese and James Cameron and Francis Ford Coppola, which I find really interesting because those directors are much higher brow than Roger Corman ever was. And Roger Corman was known for knocking movies off at a quick rate. He had a very quick turnaround with movies and he filmed them very fast. However, that did not mean that he did not put care into them just because he pumped them out really quick. He took a lot of pride in his efficiency and his ability to tell a story with limited means in a very fast amount of time. And I would say A Bucket of Blood is really a great movie. It had a $50,000 budget. It was shot in 5 days. It has a wonderful lead performance from Dick Miller. And the movie is about Dick Miller plays Walter, who is this young nerdy guy who wants to get into the cool scene, who wants to hang out with the beatniks and be part of that culture in the 1950s. But he's a busboy working at I don't know what you could call it, a beatnik hangout, where they do slam poetry and they get up and perform pretentious folk songs and say nonsensical things to make themselves sound deeper than they actually are. And his whole thing is he wants to be in on that scene, and he doesn't feel like he's capable, like he feels inept. He doesn't feel like he's capable of connecting with that world around him. So he ends up buying clay, takes it home so he can try to sculpt something because he wants to be respected as an artist. He ends up getting really frustrated, notices that his landlord's cat is in the wall and basically gets so frustrated he starts stabbing the wall to get her out, to get the cat out, and ends up stabbing the cat. So he ends up panicking. What he decides to do is take the cat, put it in the clay, make it plaster, a cat with a knife sticking out of it, and present it as a piece of art to the beatniks. So he comes the next day with the clay cat and with an art piece called Dead Cat that just blows away the beatniks. And it's obviously not even good. I think it's making fun of beatniks that they're taken away by something that's not even like actually good art. But he has basically a clay statue of a cat with a knife in it, and nobody knows that there's actually a real cat in it. And this brings him love from the beatnik scene, and they start encouraging him to make more artwork. We need to see more. They call him a master of realism. So basically what he's doing, since he's incapable of actually creating art, he basically goes on, starts off unintended, killing a lot of people, and then preserving them in clay and making these horrifying creations that look really scary. Some of the statues in this are so horrifying that they're almost funny to look at. There's a man whose head he splits open and turns him into a clay statue, just standing still, and he's horrifying to look at, but there's something almost funny the way that he presents it and the way that the beatniks are blown away. So it's a very comical, macabre little horror film about a nerd, a little dweeby little man, wonderful performance by Dick Miller, like I said, that finally gets in with the cool kids and goes on a murder spree. And what's interesting about him, he starts off as so pitiable that you feel really sorry for him, and he grows loathsome by the end of it. But even when he's a completely loathsome person, there's still something pathetic and pitiable about him. Really good, really creative, really short film. I had a blast with it. I'm choosing to highlight this. Like I said, there are tons of great masterpieces, but I'm going to go with this macabre little early exploitation film from Roger Corman.
I love Dick Miller. He became a legend.
Mm-hmm. We actually got to meet Dick Miller a couple years before he passed away. Really sweet guy.
And that's another one I haven't seen. You picked another one I haven't seen. I got to see that one.
Yeah, Bucket of Blood. Check it out. It's fun. It's I would say it's a fun horror movie with a very macabre concept. The concept behind it. Somebody making art pieces out of his victims and presenting it to the beatniks who clap and are so blown away by his realism.
And my watch list just keeps growing, dude.
It's on Amazon Prime. It's free. And it's only 65 minutes long. This is what I found watching a lot of older movies. I feel like we need to get back to shorter films to that length. Not every movie or not every story requires it to be an hour and a half or longer.
So in a decade dominated by giant monsters and sci-fi horror, I went with just the opposite direction, which is one you mentioned, Night of the Hunter, 1955. Directed by actor Charles Laughton, and this is surprisingly his only film.
Tragically, his only film.
Huh?
Tragically, his only film.
I know. He starred in The Old Dark House, Mutiny on the Bounty, and was Quasimodo in 1939, Hunchback of Notre Dame. And it was written by James Agee, who wrote African Queen. And stars, of course, the great Robert Mitchum from Cape Fear, and Shelley Winters from Lolita and Poseidon Adventure. And it's about, while in jail, a murderous religious fanatic, played by Mitchum, finds out about $10,000 that his doomed cellmate has stashed and goes after his wife and kids when he gets out. Only the kids know where the money is, and they refuse to tell. Now, this one grabs you immediately. The film opens, there's an old lady telling religious stories to kids. And then the kids find a dead body, and you know right away that Robert Mitchum did it. He talks to God using this awful blasphemy and excusing his evil by saying, your book is full of killing, so why don't I go kill, you know?
Yeah.
So he basically takes advantage of widows and takes their money. But I love the sinister and eye-catching trip to go see the widow and her kids. And he's just saying more evil shit just to show you how evil he is. Like, God sent me money and a widow in the making. Mm-hmm. Like he thought that God was blessing him by giving him this opportunity to take advantage of these people. But as artistic as it was, some of it was very maddening to me. which isn't a criticism of the movie. It's just maddening part of the story, which is the only hope these poor little kids have is their mom, their Uncle Bertie, and the mom's employer, that annoying ass old lady Icy Spoon. Mm-hmm. The wife is a complete basket case, falling hard for this fake preacher. The old lady is so charmed by the preacher that she says, "My body is quivering with cleanliness." And then the uncle gets so drunk that he can't move, much less help them. Mm-hmm. So all these adults that are around them and supposed to protect them are completely useless when it comes right down to it. And speaking of that, besides Robert Mitchum, the kids, John and Pearl, played by Billy Chapin and Sally Jane Bruce, really carry the film and keep us emotionally invested. Some of the scenes between Robert Mitchum and Billy Chapin were just fascinating. And then the little Pearl was just cute as a button. And to see a cute little innocent girl like that stuck in this sinister situation that seems hopeless at times, what really brought a lot of the tension and the horror. And by the way, for this, for this to be more of an artistic thing and not as impressive as like some of the high technology 3D movies and giant monsters and stuff, I still felt the technology that went into this movie to be very impressive. Like the underwater shot of a victim tied in a car with their throat slit where it looks like an extra mouth. The imagery was awesome. The way they did it was awesome.
I don't know if you remember this, but interestingly enough, the image you're talking about, I actually had that as my cover photo on my Facebook profile a few years back.
Oh, yeah, that's what that was.
I was watching the movie, and the image that you're talking about is, I think, one of the greatest images in any film I've ever seen. And it sounds ghoulish because it's a woman with a slit throat underwater, but there's something almost beautiful and majestic as she sits there, almost in peas dead underwater, as her hair looks like it's floating in waves.
Oh yeah,
with
it's
the water.
flowing beautifully.
Like a certain type of serenity to it that I found kind of disturbing for how calming it is.
Yeah, and still looks real. That was not her at the bottom of that.
That wasn't?
That lake. That was a dummy.
Okay, all right, that makes sense, because I always thought, I was like, damn, she really, like, that's dangerous. Like, they actually did that? Like, that it holds on that shot for a second for somebody to be that deep underwater. So I always thought she actually did that because I assumed it was real because it looks like it's her.
Yeah, one of the producers watched that footage, and he was so impressed. He was telling Shelley Winters how impressed he was by that. And she said, "Oh, that wasn't me. That was a dummy." So very impressive shot among many. So the trip for the preacher to go to the widow and the kids, that was awesome. And then little did I know there was an even more impressive type of trip when the preacher chases the kids down the river. When all the adults become useless, then the kids take off on a raft down the river. And the preacher chases after them. That whole sequence is scary, atmospheric, beautiful, unnerving. You see these great set designs that were obviously done on a soundstage, but to very artistic effect. And then you have these little scenes where they show a real spider or a toad or an owl, a turtle, a fox, just all this rich detail in this trip down the river. And then the kids go down the river and they find a new savior in Miss Cooper, played by Lillian Gish. Mm-hmm. I love this woman. She made the movie for me, and for it to be, it's almost like an entire shift in the film. You have the same threat, but an entirely different protector for these children, and she's a much more formidable protector from the get-go. Yeah, you see that this woman is passionate, and then I found it interesting that Lillian Gish was asking the director, said, "Why do you want me? Why do you want me in particular for this film?" Because he said that used to when movies were first starting in the cinema, people would lean forward in their chairs and want to see what happens next on the movie. And he said now they kind of crouch down, slouch down with their popcorn and eat. He said, "I want you because I want them to lean up in their seat again." and I can see why he said that. So, like I said, it's the same threat but entirely different protector. And I'll be damned if this menacing creature that they built the whole movie showing what a threat he was, how dangerous he was no match for Miss Cooper. She's a tiny but fierce woman who loves children, and she loves her station in life, taking care of underprivileged children. And she is not going to let anything harm those children. And I almost felt a sense of ease. Like I never felt like Robert Mitchum was a threat once Miss Cooper showed up.
I mean, my take on this is that this is a children's horror movie. And by saying that, I don't mean that it's a horror movie for children. I mean, it's about horror from a child's perspective. And I think that's what makes a lot of it scary. A lot of like the exaggerated style of the movie, like if you notice, like when he's chasing after the kids and he raises his hand, the shadow on the wall is severely exaggerated in a way that's kind of reminiscent of German expressionism. And like you said, that trip you're talking about where they see all these fantastical like spiders, but they look really unique. It's horror from a child's perspective. The movie plugs you into what the children are feeling. So you feel him as a threat to them, and he effectively becomes neutered once an effective adult actually enters the picture, and the movie ceases to do that anymore. But that's what I think makes it unique, is it has a childlike wonder to it that you feel like you're seeing it from the kid's perspective and how kids would remember something horrifying in their head. And it's really beautiful movie. I would say this is one of the greatest movies ever made. Like I really think this is it's a genuine masterpiece. Not just in horror, just in film period. I think it's one of the greatest films ever made. And what's tragic is that Charles Laughton showed so much potential as a filmmaker. I mean, this is like a filmmaker's movie, but this movie did not get good reviews when it came out. It was trashed by audiences, trashed by critics. I think it was too cerebral for people. It was too artsy. People thought it was offensive. And it was a critical and commercial failure, and Charles Laughton took it personally and decided never to attempt another movie again. And I think that's a damn shame, and that he didn't live to see its revival. Because now it's like restored by the Criterion Collection. It's preserved in the Library of Congress. It's taken on a new status, especially within the film world and cinephilia and horror, that he didn't live to see his film get the love and respect that it eventually did. He would never got to experience the revival of Night of the Hunter. And I think that sucks.
Yeah, it broke his spirit as a filmmaker, and it's so sad. Mm-hmm. I mean, look at what John Carpenter had to deal with to turn out his classics. And he kept going. Why couldn't you keep going, Charles Laughton? You could have gave us some great films, man.
I mean, studios probably wouldn't have funded it at the time. They probably looked at it as critics didn't like it and audiences didn't show up. You're not good at it.
He seemed to have such a great sensibility as a filmmaker. Like that, the part of the story that I mentioned where once Miss Cooper shows up, then Robert Mitchum no longer feels like a threat. And I think that Charles Laughton recognized that, and that's why he added this scene that I love. I'm sitting there thinking, he's never going to get to them as long as she's guarding. He's never going to get to them. But then he adds a scene. Remember that scene where it shows an owl and then it shows a bunny, and then this heightening suspense when the owl flies down to get the bunny, and you feel like it's a metaphor for what's to come. You think that Robert Mitchum is the owl and he's about to snatch these little bunnies, but no, it's just like you think it is. He has no hope against this woman.
So this was his debut movie. Can you imagine? Like, I honestly am convinced that if things had gone differently and he decided to pursue a career as a filmmaker, he would have went down as one of the greatest filmmakers in history. Yeah. If he would have just continued down this route, because there's nothing about it that feels like a debut. Like the use of cinematic language and imagery and suggestion and subjectivity and camera is not the work of an amateur. It's the work of somebody who looks like they've been directing movies forever. It's a great film. That's an awesome choice.
Look at what he had to deal with, directing little kids, and I heard that him and Pearl didn't get along at all, and he actually ended up having to yell at her a couple times, the little girl. And Robert Mitchum was notoriously difficult on set. I guess he would, huh?
It's so great.
Yeah, he would often come to the set drunk, and he would bring a flunky with him. He just brought just some random dude he brought with him, and he would get drunk and just beat the guy up on set and make everybody uncomfortable. Like,
So he was like the character he played in the movie.
yeah, and he was mean to Shelley Winters, and he said this really mean thing about her one time when he found out that she had gotten the part. He said, and this is gonna give away a spoiler in the movie, so if you haven't seen the movie, kind of tune out for a second. But I have to say this quote. So Robert Mitchum says about Shelley Winters, "She looks and sounds as much like a wasted West Virginia girl as I do. The only bit she'll do convincingly is to float down the water with her throat cut."
Yeah, he's
a mean prick, dude. A mean prick, but damn, what a performance, dude.
It's a great performance. And if you notice the speech, I just have to point this out, where he has his knuckles tattooed with love and hate. That speech is reproduced in Do the Right Thing. It's one of The Night of the Hunter is one of Spike Lee's favorite movies. So he recreates that scene with Radio Raheem, but instead of tattoos, it's like, you know, those like in hip hop in the 80s, those big gold rings that went all across your hand. They had one as love, hate, and he gives same exact speech about love and hate in the relationship between them and static, and does the same thing. I always because I love Do the Right Thing, so the first time I saw that first, I kind of like tripped out by that. The first time I saw Night of the Hunter, I was like, hey, this whole thing is, I didn't realize that was just like, it's a tribute to that movie.
Yeah. It's so effective, and he's such a uniquely smarmy type of killer.
Yeah.
Using all the blasphemy, like going as a preacher, and then when I got so pissed at him on the wedding night, the way he treated his new wife, the widow.
Yeah, he's a pretty
like
person.
Reprimanding her for wanting sex on her wedding night. What a dick.
Yeah. But yeah, that's a great choice. That's a great film. Totally. Honestly, that's if you want to be objective, like if you had to say what the best horror film of the 1950s was, I think you'd have to say The Night of the Hunter. In my opinion, anyway.
Night of the Hunter or Curse of the Demon for me.
Mm-hmm.
I love that one. So that brings us to another very interesting decade for horror, the 1960s. Now, 1950s brought a lot of innovation, brought a lot of sci-fi horror. So the studios were seeing that horror became a bankable genre again. So then I think that's why in the 60s, especially the success of, how great movies like Night of the Hunter was, where it started getting more talented filmmakers into the mix again. Like 1960s was dominated by Hitchcock, especially Psycho and The Birds. The Roger Corman Poe films with Vincent Price. George Romero revolutionized the zombie subgenre. And then you also had the birth of slashers happening in Giallo when they were rising to popularity in the 60s. So very interesting decade, and it's another decade that changed the face of horror.
Oh, yeah. And
so and the floodgates open on this one as far as notable high-quality horror films. Psycho, Rosemary's Baby, Night of the Living Dead, Birds, Eyes Without a Face, Blood and Black Lace, Repulsion, Peeping Tom, The Innocents, The Haunting, Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, Dracula, Prince of Darkness. So many great movies in the 60s. It's ridiculous.
Oh, man. Yeah, man. Yes. This was a tough one. Because you mentioned Psycho. Some of these movies that you mentioned from the 60s are not just some of the best horror movies ever made. These are some of the greatest American films. You have Psycho. You got Night of the Living Dead. You got Rosemary's Baby. You got Repulsion. There's so much to choose from. And I really these films are just incredible. And it's such a decade where I feel like the variety of horror kind of opened up a lot more. And like you said, I think it's like when the more highbrow, sophisticated horror started rearing itself into it. So much to choose from. Do you have anything else to say about the 60s?
Oh, no. I'm just waiting to hear your choice, because this is the hardest choice, probably one of the hardest choices out of all the decades.
I'm going with The Haunting from 1963, the British horror film directed by Robert Wise. Well, there's an interesting tidbit about Robert Weiss. This is just a personal thing. The man who taught me how to edit, how to do editing, was Stephen Hirohama. Was actually mentored by Robert Weiss, who's a Hollywood legend.
Cool.
Edited Citizen Kane, had his own film career. But yeah, I'm picking The Haunting. It's the film just depicts the experiences of a small group of people invited by a paranormal investigator to investigate a purportedly haunted house. And my God, this movie is incredible in a way that's hard to put into words. It's the first haunted house movie for me that I've ever seen that could challenge The Shining to the title of the ultimate haunted house horror film. Like, I think this is the only one I could think of that really challenges it. A lot of people say The Changeling. I love The Changeling. That's a wonderful film. I don't think it's as good as either The Haunting or The Shining. That's just my personal opinion. The movie stars Julie Harris, Claire Bloom, Richard Johnson, and Russ Tamblyn. Paranormal investigator who it's about a paranormal investigator who was kind of raised amongst like upper class elite British people. Was raised to be a very logical person and to reject anything that was like irrational or supernatural. And because his family was so like that, he decided to go in the exact opposite direction and dedicate his life into investigating the supernatural, the unknown, which is beyond our comprehension. So he goes to Hill House and he invites several different people to join him to do an experiment. And the reason he invites them is because every person he invites has had a different experience with the paranormal in their life, and they feels that he wanted people there that would be receptive to it, that would kind of be able to receive it, that would be able to draw out the haunting of the house itself. And the haunting is actually Hill House, iconic Hill House. And my God, this is an incredible set. The movie, the house itself is gorgeous to look at. It looks like a beautiful mansion to live in. The way that it's photographed in black and white, you get a sense of how big it is and how gorgeous. You feel like you're in the presence of splendor, of something grand. At the same time, they even explain in the movie there's something that's very off about the house, and the way that the house is designed. The person who lived in it before made everything slightly askew. So none of the doors are straight. They're slightly off the hinges. None of the angles in the corners of the room go the way that they're supposed to. It's a very confusing, disorienting house. And the movie uses a lot of the fisheye lens, widescreen lens, where the house that's already disorienting, and it makes the house even more disorienting. When you're watching it, you feel like you're watching the house turn into a sort of distortion of itself. And it's so creepy and so suggestive. Just, it manages to make things like somebody banging on a door over and over and over, and people on the other side heart beating, like nothing really happening but that, or a door being look like it's about to burst through or explode. Just so many things happening that are hard to put in words. It gives you the experience of a supernatural haunting where nothing can reach you or none of it's physically touching you, but you feel the presence everywhere and it's overwhelming you and it's kind of dragging you down psychologically. Like the way that this movie is filmed is so impressive. I think the Conjuring films owe a great debt to The Haunting in terms of the style that they're trying to use. Really well edited, well directed, well acted. All of the characters are interesting, and it's interesting to see certain characters, even though every person has had an experience with the supernatural or with the paranormal, not all of them believe in it, even though they've had that experience. So it's interesting to see the mix of personalities of people who do believe in the paranormal and people who don't take it seriously, and to see the different ways that the haunting has to go further for the suggestion to be clearer to a person who wants to think more logically. The way that it goes after different people, like it's really, really a great, like feels like the model for haunted house horror movies, and the skill with which it's made at is unbelievable. Just well shot. Like I don't think there's like a frame wrong with the movie at all. And it's engrossing, it's creepy, it's scary, it's gorgeous to look at. It's everything a haunted house movie should be.
So needless to say, it probably the remake paled in comparison.
Oh, my lord. I actually saw the remake years ago, way before I ever saw the original. And just by trying to recall, that hunk of shit does not even come close to doing what the original does. Like, there is no point to remake this movie. It's perfect as it is.
Yeah, this is one of my more shameful blind spots. I have not seen The Haunting, and
This
that's
is
probably my favorite subgenre is paranormal.
and what's shocking is this is more up your alley than most of the movies on here.
Yeah. So I'm ashamed of myself, and I'm watching that ASAP.
Yep, The Haunting. Check it out. Great movie.
So my pick for the 60s is a highly acclaimed film from 1962, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane.
Oh, that's
Directed by... Huh?
That's another great one.
Oh, yeah. Directed by Robert Aldrich, who directed Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte and The Dirty Dozen, and
Kiss
written
Me
by
Deadly.
Lucas... Huh?
Kiss Me Deadly.
Yeah.
Remember
And
that?
written by Lucas Heller, who also wrote Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte and The Dirty Dozen, based on the novel by Henry Farrell, and stars, of course, the legendary Betty Davis and Joan Crawford. It's about two sisters, Jane, played by Betty Davis, and Blanche, played by Joan Crawford. Both former child stars live together in a swank Hollywood mansion. Jane is determined to make her comeback while tormenting her more popular paraplegic sibling and keeping her hostage, fearing that she will steal her spotlight. Now, for me, watching this is the ultimate sibling rivalry film, and Betty Davis is the ultimate evil sister. She just owned that part where you forgot it was Betty Davis and it seemed like she was baby Jane. And Jane was the more popular one as a kid. It created a great dynamic. She was more popular as a kid, and then the other, obviously emotionally neglected Blanche, became more popular as they got older, and then the bitterness festered between them. So then Blanche is confined to a wheelchair, and you see that it's obvious that the sister had something to do with it. So she just torments this poor woman. And what I really loved about this is I thought it was going to be like, judging by who was in it and who directed it, I'm like, this is going to be an exercise in excellent cinema and powerhouse acting. But for me, and this is a compliment, it did not feel like I was watching a great cinematic achievement, or I didn't feel like I was watching two powerhouse actresses mixing it up. All I felt was just pure tension, anxiety, emotion, creepiness, atmosphere. That's all I felt in this. I didn't feel like I was watching an exercise in cinema. I love how you can feel Jane's frustration as Blanche keeps ringing her bell, and you know, Jane's obviously the bad one, the evil one, the mean one, but you still feel her frustration when constantly ringing that damn bell when she's trying to concentrate on her comeback. And then you also feel Blanche's panic when Jane starts to completely go off the rails. So she just torments her slowly throughout the whole thing, and then the torment slowly turns to violence and menace. And then Jane ends up kicking the shit out of Blanche at one point, to where it looks like a real beatdown. And then I can't say enough.
Can I tell you something really quick? Don't forget the point you're making. You said it looks like a real beatdown. It is a real beatdown. I think it shows in the movie they had an antagonistic relationship on set. They even made a series about it on FX. So she was actually hitting her and like really abusing her. So Joan Crawford was actually taking abuse from Betty Davis, and they were not getting along. So you know the scenes where Betty Davis is dragging Joan Crawford and she looks like she's struggling?
Oh, yeah.
The reason that she's struggling is because she actually is, to take revenge on all the abuse she was taking. She had some of the people on the set who felt bad for her, fill her body with all kinds of weight and extra stuff. So when she's dragging her around, she's really struggling. So that was her payback. So Betty Davis got really worn out after abusing her. So that was kind of, they had payback. So there was that actual tension happening on the set. And I think it kind of reflects in the performances and the intensity of the movie. And it's like I said, it's the reason I think that you get the feeling that you're not watching cinema, you're just watching a tense situation unfold, because it kind of actually was happening while they were filming it.
Yeah, and they had that real life tension before the movie, real life tension after the movie. I mean, during the movie and after. So
yeah,
they're constantly at each other's throats. But I think later on they finally found a mutual respect for each other. Yeah, where they respected the skills and the talent of the other without actually respecting their personality. Mm-hmm. But I can't say enough about the score in this film. It's amazing with the overall mood, and then these really great flourishes and moments where it adds another layer to already genuine creepiness. It adds another layer to it. And then, wow, what a climax. Everything comes to a head in the climax. Everything you see kind of tossed around and played around with through the whole movie, and all the psychological shit, all the psychological shit all comes to a head. All the violence comes to a head, and it's just awesome. And then that the I've Written a Letter to Daddy song, that creeped me out so bad. It's because it shows her singing it as a little girl, and then she sings it as this old lady, and she's like, "I've written a letter to Daddy." She says it with this little munchkin voice, and it just makes her look and sound even more unhinged. But this actually nominated for a bunch of Oscars, and it won Oscar for Best Costume Design, and it was nominated for Best Actress for Bette Davis, Best Actor Victor Buono, and Best Cinematography Ernest Haller, excellent cinematography, and it was also nominated for Best Sound. And you mentioned some of the rivalry with Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. I thought it was funny that Bette Davis had a Coke machine installed on set to provoke Joan Crawford, who was married to the chairman of Pepsi. And then also Joan Crawford would send little notes and gifts to everyone in the crew, so she would win their favor and get them to like her. And Bette Davis sent her a note on set that said, "Get off the crap," in bold letters. And then it's notable to point out also, I mentioned the look of Bette Davis and how she looks so unhinged, especially singing that I've Written a Letter to Daddy song.
It's also that makeup they put on too.
Yeah. Well, Bette Davis loved looking horrible in the film. She reveled in it. The more grotesque and crony she looked, the more she liked it. So she wanted to look like she was an old aging starlet who was stuck in this house. So she would never even bother to take her makeup off. So she would just pile makeup on top of makeup. So she just reveled in looking horrible, but Joan Crawford would refuse to look unattractive. So it was a constant challenge. It was Bette Davis berating her, the director constantly begging her to look disheveled. And there's this one part where she's coming down the stairs and she has her hand on the railing coming down the stairs. It took a half a day for the director to convince Joan Crawford not to wear nail polish on her fingers that day. Because he's like, "You're a paraplegic, you're an aging starlet in this house. You should look, somewhat close to being as disheveled as Bette Davis was."
But she didn't want to. She had to be the more glamorous.
Yeah, so everything about this movie, like the real life rivalry kind of feeding into the drama and the tension of the film, the look of it, the score, the acting performances, I loved it all. I really enjoyed it. It's very entertaining and unnerving at the same time.
Yeah, it's an exciting movie. Yeah, I really like that director a lot. And I mentioned Robert Aldrich did Kiss Me Deadly, which is one of my favorite films, weirdest film noirs I could think of. I could tell that's the same sensibility. He had a very off-kilter, more subversive style from the era that he was from. His movies felt slightly more dangerous than what you would typically see in the 50s or early 60s. It was like a great style. I just want to mention, too, this is Hill House. I know you can't see it very well. You can't see it at all if you're only listening to it, but here's Hill House.
Such a great house.
Yeah. So that's actually an awesome choice, too. I really like the selections that you've made.
I like yours, too. It's pretty interesting contrast in the choices that we made.
Yep.
I like how we both mix a mixture of obvious choices with not so obvious choices.
Yeah. So that was the first half, and that is our 100th episode. We are going to be back next week for 101 to finish off the decade of cinema with the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s, and 2010s.
Yeah, and we're going to try to fit all 10 decades into one episode, but we're like, if we're going to give any credit that these movies deserve, we really need to take time and discuss each one and each decade in detail and not kind of rush through it. So we kind of split it into two parts.
Yep. Well, Keep up with us on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Pickles Horror Show, on Instagram @Pickles Horror Show. Where else are we? We're everywhere. We're on SoundCloud, we're on Spotify, we're on Apple Podcasts, and we're on YouTube. So check us out there.
You can go to www.flow.page/Ghostman and Rivera, and that gives you access to all of it, YouTube and everything. We've been releasing our best of 2020 interview clips, so check those out on our Facebook page, and we'll be posting them to Instagram too. So we wanted to post those leading up to our 100th episode and jumping into 2021 here.
Perfect. Till next week, folks. Happy horror.
Happy